Hey, hello everyone, and thanks for joining our webinar today. So we have Travis today, and Travis is an amazing guy whom I have known for last few years. While during the days since he was at Netflix, I was following Travis. I was following Jason Chan all about all the amazing cloud security things at that time Netflix was releasing. So been following, and thanks for joining today, Travis. By the way.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So we are going to have a quick, very candid discussion around how we can go ahead and prevent breaches, especially in the cloud environment, using some cloud Blueprints. So these days there are a lot of cloud breaches that are happening or incidents that are happening out there, especially because of these unknown exposures or shadow IT assets that are out there, especially facing to the internet ones. So I just want to pick up some points from your perspective, Travis. What are the best practices and these type of things? With
Yeah.
that said, right, to have this foundation kind of a thing clear, according to you, what is a cloud blueprint and how do you think a cloud blueprint can be used to secure the customer's cloud environments?
Yep. Great question. So the thing about cloud, right? It allows this all to move very quickly. That's why people like cloud. And another change that we, aside from mass migration to cloud, is DevOps. So in the old days, we had software engineers, and then we had all these other folks around them. Think infrastructure, security, and then DevOps happened, right? There's a ton of benefits of DevOps. You can now move fast, independently. But what it's done is pushed a lot of the complexity for how to use cloud onto developers. So one example that I use, S3, it has to be general enough that it works for all of the customers of Amazon. And what that means is that there's a ton of knobs on it. So S3 has 70 things that you can go and set in there. With some of the announcements at reInvent, that's probably even more now. And basically, your users, the software engineers, developers, they don't really want to have to become an expert to know how to correctly set those up for both their use cases and also to meet the business's SRE, security, compliance requirements. And so the point of a blueprint is to give them a fast, easy, repeatable way to get their infrastructure set up. So instead of having to go into the console and click things, which obviously from a security standpoint is bad, because now you have people that have full permission on S3 to make changes. You can use infrastructure as code. The engineers don't have to learn how to write infrastructure as code. And more importantly, they don't need to go and learn all of the kind of nuanced settings of S3 and how they should be setting that up. So that's what a cloud blueprint is. It's a reusable pattern that you can give to your developers that when they need a cloud service, or even outside of cloud, like things like Okta, GitHub, Databricks, when they need that, they can go and use the blueprint and get basically expert guidance about how they should be setting things up to get what they need done.
Got it. So the cloud blueprints will help us to create basically infrastructure as a templates, right? As a code, as a templates. Do you think all cloud blueprints are secure by default, or we need the security engineers to harden those blueprints to make those cloud blueprints actually secure, Travis?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like they are not all secure by default. So there's been some cases, especially recently, where things like Terraform modules have misconfiguration built into them. And so it's basically a supply chain problem, right? Like if you're using a module, you need to know exactly what's in that module because the system that deploys it, if it's like Terraform, that has a lot of permissions in your environment. So if it's deploying bad, the blast radius there is very high. And then the other thing is like, I don't think secure by default is kind of, first of all, it's subjective. So like secure for company A is going to be different than company B. It's very dependent on the context of your environment, what your compliance standards are, what kind of data things have. So I think secure by default templates that work for everybody is not really possible. And what you need to do instead is take some kind of standard that you like, NIST, CIS, whatever, and then build blueprints that fit that according to your specific business requirements. So there is some customization. That's why, when people get into like writing Terraform modules, it can be very difficult for them. What we've done in Resourcely is you can use Terraform modules if you like, but you can also just write a template and add the requirements onto it. So it takes a lot of the load bearing off of the blueprint itself because it has basically like requirements that sit on top of it via guardrails.
Yeah, totally to the point. And thanks a lot for that explanation, Travis. And it also makes it the life of even the developers and also the security engineers, their life easy as well. Because if we go through the click ops kind of a thing, maybe we do it, we follow the security configuration, we get it done right in the first time. Maybe the second time we'll get it run, but keep doing it in the manual way too many times. Definitely, they will end up missing that kind of a thing, and will end up putting some insecure resources out there. So
Yeah, even if your team is like very familiar with exactly what you need to do, it's
yeah,
people, right? We can miss steps. Like pilots have checklists for a reason. They have to go through that exact checklist, even though they've done it, thousands of times. They know exactly what they're doing. They need to follow the checklist rigorously. And so that's like kind of best case, right? You have your developers that follow a very prescriptive checklist about exactly how to set something up. That's still a lot of work for them. They're still likely to miss something. So, and usually developers miss things, or they're not aware of the standards in the first place. So that's where today the current state is a lot of misconfiguration gets deployed. This is why CSPM is a very popular category, right? Because it gives security teams visibility of all of those issues, so you can at least do something about it. The point of a blueprint is to just get those set up correctly from the first place. You don't have to go fix them later.
Yeah. Even though being a security engineer, I know how many times I went ahead and made a S3 bucket public by mistake. So yeah, pretty common stuff.
Yeah, it's there's definitely like the public S3 buckets, but there's a lot of kind of accidental mistakes. So like one time when we were at Netflix, we had SecurityMonkey, which is an open source CSPM, very early. And SecurityMonkey, like most CSPMs, it was visibility driven from the beginning. So we'd look at like public queues. And then what we built was basically an auto remediation module. So queues, the way the policy is written, it's very easy for a user that's not an expert to accidentally make their queue public to the world. And so we had basically a module in SecurityMonkey that would observe that. And when somebody made it public, it would close it. And I remember one time sitting there, we had an alert every time that we closed one. And I remember watching one of our users fight with SecurityMonkey. So they would write the policy that made it open. SecurityMonkey would close it. They'd go and put it back and make it open again. And so like, this is obviously like not the user trying to make their queue public. They just thought the right way to do it accidentally made it public for them.
Yeah, and dude would be wondering like what's wrong with AWS? Every time make it public, or AWS automatically makes it private. But
they didn't even think they were making it public. They just thought they were doing it the right way for their app. And then sometimes like the right secure way is actually like hard to set up and do, right? So like you have deep AppSec background. How many times have you seen people like hard coding a temp path, right? It's like /temp/ whatever. There's problems with that. How many times have you seen people chmod 777 on the file? It's because like there's the right file permissions there, but like them knowing exactly what those are without being a security person is hard. And so they just do the easy thing because it's like, I just need my app to work. I'll go fix it later. And then as we know, like too often people just forget about it and they don't go fix it later. And this is how we get security exposure.
Yeah, initially we always start with the POC of simple functionality, follow the instructions from Stack Overflow. The functionality will work, and then we start iterating and building more stuff on top of it, and then we totally forget about securing it by default or hardening it in the first place or doing it in the right way in the first place.
That's right. Yeah, and I mean, there's so much, kind of like bad information on the internet. Stack Overflow is a good example. So if you're like, oh, I need infrastructure as code for whatever, like there's no vetting that like that answer is going to be good. It's not going to expose you to a security issue. It's not going to be very expensive. And then this is, gotten worse in some ways with the advent of LLMs because it's trained on internet scale data. So if you're using an LLM to generate something like infrastructure as code, it'll happily give you the wrong answer, right? It doesn't know that it's a security exposure. It just knows that like this is something that's seen in its training data. So I think that this problem's actually gotten a little bit worse for security folks because of LLMs.
Yeah. And then you need to go ahead and ask another prompt telling that, okay, what is the right secure way of doing it? And then it says, apologies, it's not secure because the port 80 is open, or port 43 is open, or 21 is open, whatever it is, it's just the excuse. And then it starts writing the right CloudFormation template. So yeah.
And I'll give you an example of this too. So like, bucket logging, like, is that secure? Like, yeah, it's obviously like more secure than not having it. But the problem with bucket logging is it can get extremely expensive. So if you put that on your big data bucket, your bill's going to, blow your eyes out of your head. So there's like things like that are just very context dependent. Like if you have a bucket with your sensitive data, you probably want to put monitoring on it. If you have your big data S3 bucket, like you probably do not want to put monitoring on it.
Yeah, we do. I was working at a media organization in my initial stage of my career, and they used to host all these streaming videos in S3 bucket. And all of a sudden, we came to know about a new AWS service called as AWS Macie, and it goes ahead and scans in bucket and then checks for malware or whatever the misconfigurations, identifies the DLP sort of things. And we did enable those things on all the S3 buckets in a couple of accounts. Those accounts were having S3 buckets with all these content discovery video channels, like multiple episodes. So it was around like thousands of gigabytes. And we got a huge AWS bill from Macy just because we were following the security practices without the context around it. Can we do it? Is it feasible to do it or not? Yeah, totally.
Of course. Yeah. So that's another thing, when you talk about guardrails, like developers are often not going to, be talking with the AWS team and understand how expensive a service is. If they write something like infrastructure as code that turns on Macy, your Terraform deployer will happily, go and deploy that for you. And there's no checks and balances. It's just going to happen. And then you'll get a big bill. So this is the kind of thing where, unless you're willing to review every single infrastructure as code change in your environment, you need to expect that things like this are going to slip through unless you put, guardrails on it.
Yep. So Travis, we were talking about a lot of cloud risks and these type of things, right? According to you, why are these cloud exposures or cloud risks too significant for an organization?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it very much depends on the organization that you're talking about. So, kind of like tier 0 here is compliance, right? So like if you're doing business with other businesses, then you're going to at minimum have something like SOC 2 compliance. If you're dealing with the government, you're going to have FedRAMP. If you're dealing with payment card data, you're going to have PCI. So all these standards. And like number one is if you're out of compliance with your standards and you actually like don't get your compliance certification, it can impact your ability to do business. Similarly, as businesses, we often have to make customer promises, in contract a lot of the times. And so if we're out of compliance with that, it can lead to all kinds of bad outcomes that we've seen, coverage for, CISOs getting prosecuted, things like that. So that's another one. And then number 3, so if just the impact of data breaches is really interesting. So I did some slides earlier this year, and I found a graph that shows basically like what happens to public company stocks after a breach. And it was really surprising for me. So many of them take, a hit, but like they actually recover fairly quickly. I think the median time to recover to pre-breach level was 57 days. So what that's saying is like the market will, penalize you initially, but it'll quickly recover. That being said, there has been some breaches that have been catastrophic for businesses. So for example, Maersk, a big shipping company, they had basically like full infrastructure down outage because of a compromise that they had, 5 or 6 years ago, something like that. And so that impacted, they lost $1 billion in revenue is the number that I saw from that. So like that kind of just, hard downtime. Or think about was Caesars, I think it was earlier this summer. But that kind of impact, it's just like it affects your ability to operate your company. And if your company is producing continuous revenue, that can be obviously very detrimental. And then there's finally, loss of customer trust. There's all of the kind of legal recovery work that you have to do. There's the actual like incident management that's very disruptive for the business. So I think these things just really add up, but it obviously depends on your industry.
Got it. So Travis, I was just when you mentioned that, I was just looking at googling what is I don't know when CrowdStrike incident has happened. It was around July 19th or July 3rd week, and I was looking like what is a CrowdStrike stock. So it's a significant drop, and then after a couple of months, it came back to normal. So I think for few folks, this can be taken as a huge brand risk and loss of $1 million. And for few other folks, it can be taken as a stock market advice to buy stocks when the incident happens and then wait for 60 days for it to get the correction.
That's right. Yeah, buy the dip. I mean, look at Equifax. They had this like very big breach, but first of all, you don't choose to do business with Equifax. Like they're collecting your data and selling it no matter what. And then also you could argue that some of these companies post breach are probably more secure than their competitors, right? Because they actually put in the effort and muscle to clean things up, get a good security team. So yeah, it's really interesting, like what happens to these stocks. But what we see in general is the market does not penalize you. I think the researchers that produced the graph that I use, they said after 6 months, there's zero correlation between a stock price and whether the company had a breach or not. So it's a short-lived effect, but it's painful when it's happening.
It does. And some of the cloud exposures, right? What we do, we care about only one type of threat at risk for the external threats. So we do all the cloud attack surface management, and one of the most painful things that we have identified and helped our customers to recover is Elasticsearch clusters with no authentication exposed to the internet on that port, on the default port.
Mhm.
So those type of things. So it's a huge financial service organization with a ton of data analytics information, business intelligence data in the cluster. And we did a huge research as well to identify how many Elasticsearch clusters are there in just the Amazon IP space, the public IP space of AWS. Just by scanning the ASNs, we found that it was 43,000 Elasticsearch clusters that are out there that are public and open to the internet.
Yeah.
So, and imagine about the data that is out, that is present in those clusters.
We see this a lot. I wouldn't be surprised if the government kind of like up levels the regulation the same way that EU has done with GDPR. It's just, companies like we just talked about, right? They'll be kind of like reckless in some cases with customer data, and then the stock recovers. So what that's saying is that the market's not we should either all admit that like this isn't actually important and stop saying it's important, or there needs to be more market pressure to actually go and do the right thing, which means, more compliance standards. So like, for example, if you're running a B2C company, like you're selling products directly to consumers, like there's no kind of like default SOC 2 equivalent, right? Like there's no kind of minimum bar that guarantees that you're going to be protecting their data well.
Yes, totally. So Travis, following up to that, right? What role do you think the cloud blueprints or the hardened cloud blueprints especially play the risk in reducing the external attack surface in a cloud environment? Because most of the time in a given organization, if there is an incident in their cloud environment, most of the time it will be because of something that is present in the cloud environment and it is exposed to the internet. So what role these blueprints can play in reducing the external attack surface in a given cloud environment?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different ways, right? So making it really easy for the developers to get their job done. So think about like, publicly shared EBS snapshots. That could just be a mistake. It could also be that they didn't understand how to actually get, the EBS shared with whatever they needed it to be shared with. So there's things like that. Zero trust, I think, is a pretty critical control. So network, it's becoming clear that like network controls alone, especially in today's complex environments, they're prone to mistakes. And so, Google did the BeyondCorp publication, right? And it's like, let's just assume that like everything's on the internet and design around that. So now we have identity aware proxies that like you have to be properly authenticated in order to even connect to it. But like the setting up of those can be very complex. So we saw AL Beast earlier this year. AL Beast was a case where it's just, the actual configuration of the ALB and the security groups was complex and users hadn't done it correctly. So that wasn't like a, hey, we're trying to set this up and we wanted it to be open to the internet. It's just like they didn't know how to do it correctly. So that's where those kinds of things are where blueprints can be very, very helpful. It's like, I have this use case. I don't know how to make the cloud do what I want, and giving the users like a way that does it securely, that they can easily use, I think is like extremely helpful.
Yeah, totally. And we have seen a lot of big enterprise customers as well using the blueprints for securing their Kubernetes services. Like go ahead and use the blueprints to deploy network policies either via Azure CNIs to isolate the namespaces or make sure the pods are running with non-root access or permission levels using the pod security policies. And we do also have the same blueprints for disabling the public API server access and enforcing the RBACs on the Kubernetes clusters, because we did, or just like how I have identified 43,000 Elasticsearch clusters that are public to the internet just in the AWS IP space. In the same way, we also identified EKS, AKS kind of public APIs as well to the that are available. And for the folks who are trying to understand what is EKS, AKS, public APIs kind of services, it's basically a control plane API for managing a huge Kubernetes cluster that can be very useful for containerized deployments in some enterprise organizations or big organizations. So that's the context. So all these blueprints we also think can be strongly used.
There's a couple other things. So like IAM, for example, extremely powerful service, extremely critical. If you have an IAM, overly broad, that can be the difference between, attacker gets onto your box and they're contained there, or attacker gets onto your box and they pivot to wherever your sensitive data is and like everything's gone, right? So that's all like IAM. The thing about IAM is it's very complex. So when it gets down to like, what actions do I actually need to attach? We see a lot of like, star kind of stuff going on there where we shouldn't. And it's just because users don't understand how to set it up. So at Netflix, we built an open source tool called ConsoleMe. And ConsoleMe was really like an IAM policy wizard. And the reason for that, like users needed to be able to self-service change their stuff, but we wanted to do it from a kind of least privilege and definitely make sure that there was no star flying around. Something else we see a lot of today is, AI use cases, right? So like, obviously, like I think every business is trying to figure out, hey, how can we actually use AI in our environment? We want to encourage developers to go and spin up these use cases and tests to see like what's working and what makes sense to keep moving forward. But you probably don't want your AI use case to have, sensitive data to like wherever your customers are, right? So like, that's the kind of thing where with a blueprint, you give them like fast, easy spin up, but it has the right guardrails onto it. So you don't have these kind of accidents.
Yeah, I never realized the value of a simple star or asterisk before starting to understand the risks around IAM, because we have like just in one cloud service provider, we have like 300 services, and each and every service have approximately 200 APIs in it. So for a developer to make sure they craft the right amount of permission sets, it's a nightmare. And then all they do is like go ahead and add a simple asterisk and all their problems are solved. But for an attacker with that kind of a simple asterisk, any SSRF vulnerability that they identify in a given EC2 server, it's like giving keys to the entire kingdom in a silver plate.
Yep, exactly.
Perfect. So in your perspective, right, Travis, so what are the most common cloud exposures that organizations are facing today?
Yeah, most common cloud exposures, like you said, anything that's open to the internet, overly broad IAM. There's actually, if you're using infrastructure as code, which I think is really good, right? Because it basically allows multiplayer and review, and you can pull back the permissions that all your developers have. There's actually some interesting ones where you abuse the Terraform deployer itself. So for example, like probably nobody wants a developer to be able to create a PR, and then that thing gets executes with Cloud Admin. But that's basically what you can do with the Terraform runner. So if you use like basically a malicious provider, Terraform will pull in that provider during the init phase or after the init phase, and so you can basically get remote code execution in the context of your runner. And then there's also local exec, which will basically like just run commands as the runner. And unfortunately, local exec is required in a lot of use cases. But if a developer gets their machine compromised and creates a PR with the wrong local exec command, then it can be pretty catastrophic for businesses. So there's a lot of stuff there too that I think people, there's been some good blog posts and talks about these recently, but I think a lot of people still don't realize that these are possible.
Yeah, a lot of stuff around the GitHub Actions as well, right? So you get the same kind of a thing. So pretty popular. And to add to a little more context to what Travis has mentioned around the cloud exposures, the common stuff, we have been doing it on a full-fledged stuff in terms of for the cloud attack surface management, various type of exposures. Like it can be a storage exposure, database exposure, API exposure. It can be an simple compute exposure or some shadow IT assets. So ton of stuff in storage. It's like S3 Azure blobs being public or exposed DynamoDBs or Elasticsearch clusters with the internet-facing stuff. Very, very common. And we have also started seeing the API gateway with having a list of APIs without any authentication or authorization in place. So those are basically IDOS kind of vulnerabilities that we have seen in the cloud environments. The APIs to the accessible from the internet with no authentication or no authorization. And to make it worse, if those APIs are connected to some Lambda function, and that Lambda function is having an IAM role with asterisks, as we have discussed earlier, it's again giving the keys to the kingdom to the attackers in a silver plate.
Yep, exactly. And then, I think people say like, is this the cloud provider's responsibility to fix these things? But, the truth is like these services require you to be able to configure it that way. So we can do, work to make the default the secure way, and then you have to go and deliberately change it. But the cloud providers need to support these kind of like insecure configurations. And historically, cloud providers have often leaned towards less secure in some cases because the security controls add complexity. They want people to get started fast. So it's kind of a balancing act. I think we're moving more towards secure by default now, but there's still a lot of foot guns that users are not aware of.
Yep. Totally. And following up to that question, right? Uh, I think in terms of identifying the external resources, or in terms of reducing the attack surface, how do you think these blueprints can be used, Travis?
Yeah, tons of ways. So, something like a hardened container or VM image, like you can build one of these. It's stripped down. It doesn't have a lot of vulnerable dependencies into it, but like, how do you actually get people to use that and adopt it? So, if people are spinning up virtual machines in the console, they might pick the wrong AMI. It doesn't have all of your stuff into it. If you have a blueprint, which like here's your kind of like out of the box virtual machine or container deployment, it can just be pre-configured to use the golden image. So there's definitely stuff like that. There's things like kind of like IAM presets. So it's like, oh, I need whatever, like S3 read, and it'll set it up for you. There's obviously like CAN networking patterns. So like we talked earlier about identity aware proxies. So it's like we're going to have a zero trust kind of like building block that we just give to everybody. So like there's definitely a lot of stuff like that. And anything down to like monitoring, right? So you guys do a lot in terms of like detection and response stuff. So if you have the right kind of playbooks on your machines, then you can more effectively run incident response. So get those set up. Make sure that your agents are installed. All of those kind of things also are assisted by blueprints.
And do you think these blueprints can also be used to increase the visibility in terms of security monitoring for the security engineers?
Yeah, definitely. So if you can configure, whatever your workload is to have all of the right kind of stuff, the logging set up, done correctly, agents which will help you know what's going on, but they have to be included. Otherwise you're flying blind. You don't have that stuff. And it's the kind of thing that often your developers won't think about, right? Like the SRE team really cares, security really cares, but developers don't think about it. So that's where just have it come for free in the blueprint. We talked earlier, like logging can be very expensive. So some stuff probably doesn't make sense to have logging, but that's where you can ask the user intent. It's like, all right, well, like what kind of workload are we talking about here? What kind of data is this thing going to hold? And then based on the answer, you can choose whether you do extensive logging, which is going to be more expensive, or you don't do it, which will obviously save money, but you're not going to have the kind of stuff you need to respond.
Yeah. Totally. And to add a couple more points, right? I have seen also organizations use sometimes. I mean, they use service catalog or some type of control tower kind of an facility to go ahead every time a new account, cloud account, or Google Cloud project, or a Google or Microsoft Azure tenant is created. They use these hardened templates to implement a set of base security controls in that cloud environment or cloud account. It can be logging, it can be guard duty monitoring, or it can be anything like that. So from what I've seen, these type of blueprints, when they have used at the initial stages of the cloud environment setup, getting that monitoring up and running was very easy. You get all these logs pushed to a centralized S3 bucket. That configuration is done, enabling cloud training is done, and then getting all the HTTP logs from the load balancers and those type of things are also configured. So definitely the security engineers or incident response teams especially get a ton of visibility. And there is also drift protection as well. If you try to do it manually, as we discussed in the initial talk, right? If you do it manually, the security engineers are good at doing things or configuring things and manually, but eventually they'll forget one or two steps. That creates a blind spot in the incident response Splunk playbooks or Splunk correlation rule sets, where we don't get any of those alerts because the logs are not coming from that individual cloud environment because of someone or some security engineer doing it manually in that cloud environment. So
Yep, exactly.
too many. So we were talking about cloud environments so far, like Travis, and now I would like to understand how the same kind of blueprints can be applied across multiple cloud environments when all these multiple cloud environments do have a little bit things differently in terms of how they do or how they work.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, each cloud has their own nuanced configuration. So like IAM is very different in AWS than Google and different in Azure. And so this is the kind of thing where if you're in a multi-cloud, the complexity for your developers gets even more intense than it was before. And so this is where like blueprints can smooth it over, right? Like you might have, in a basic case, you might have a blueprint for storage across all three clouds, right? So it's like, here's your AWS S3, here's your Google bucket, whatever, right? Like so you have those blueprints set up. The user, based on where they're deploying, can take one or more of those things and deploy their whole application in the cloud. And you can standardize some of the settings there. So the instance types obviously are like different in AWS than they are for Google. And you can basically create like kind of enums for your users. So it's like, this is a medium instance, and that maps to something different in AWS and Google. But from a user, they get a consistent experience. They don't have to worry about how to map that over directly themselves. I've seen all the way from some companies, they just abstract away like completely from their users, like what cloud are they deploying into? They do like load balancing or routing based on like what's going to be cost effective for them. If you're going to that, like it's very fat platform, right? So like the users, obviously like the code that they write is also going to be different if they're addressing an AWS or a Google bucket or whatever. So in that case, it's not enough to just set up the infrastructure in a way that abstracts from users. They need to be using like custom libraries that can also handle the differences in those things. But yeah, definitely like blueprints play a big role in enabling folks to do multi-cloud effectively, because if you're using all three major clouds, then a developer's, the amount of stuff they need to know tripled essentially.
Yeah, totally. And Travis, I also want to understand, right? Do you think the external threat intelligence or threat intelligence feeds from the external attack surface management or any of the external threat intelligence tools can be used as and some kind of integration with the blueprints to harden the cloud security environments?
Yeah, so this is definitely more of your space than mine. I've seen threat intel done somewhat well and somewhat ineffectively in previous organizations. We have a concept in Resourcely called campaigns. So like blueprints and guardrails are really about setting things up correctly from the get-go. But a campaign is a way to use basically guardrails to go and make changes to infrastructure. And so one use for this, when you get threat intel that's saying like, hey, there's like this specific attack pattern, you can use the guardrails to go and assess like what needs to change as a result of that and like help roll out the changes very quickly to it. So I think, you've mentioned like kind of IP feeds, right? It's like, oh, this is a bad IP. So when that happens, you're going to want a way to go and like actually get that on your list effectively everywhere. And that's the kind of thing that we've seen campaigns be very useful for.
Definitely. And to add a couple more things as well, right? We go ahead and get these indicators of compromises, and we do have an amazing blueprint with a WAF preset, WAF configuration preset blueprint, and that can be used to be deployed in multiple cloud environments every time. And a developer wants to set up a web application, the basic things are like a CDN and then a WAF in front of it. So this blueprint, which is trying to create a WAF configuration, if it is getting all this intelligence from the external threat intel feeds around what are the malicious IPs and what are the command and control service IPs, what are the indicators of compromises, what are the malicious subdomains, all that kind of stuff being added to this denial list, IP denial list, or some kind of block list, definitely stops these bad actors targeting us in the first place. I have also seen some organizations using the zero-day vulnerability intelligence as well. Like, for example, as of today, these are the 10 Python CVEs which are actively being exploited in the wild. And these CVEs are mapped to XYZ CPEs. And those CPEs are present in my golden AMIs. And now I want to have, I already have a patching schedule using my blueprints. So I have like 100 blueprints. Out of those 100 blueprints, 20 or 30 of them have to be updated. And those updates have to be rolled out to the application as well. Which one can I prioritize? I can prioritize the ones which are having the high CPEs or high criticality, highly abused or highly targeted CVEs that are out there. So that kind of an external CV intelligence or vulnerability intelligence can also be used in terms of maturing the blueprints and hardening the blueprints and rolling it out quickly. I think
we also had like obviously like a very big public one of these with Log4j, right? Like Log4j is like just like internet melting critical vulnerability that everyone was trying to figure out like how to address in the first place. So this is where if you have blueprints, you can make like redeployment very easy. So it's like we're gonna update the version of your library, then you need to go and deploy. You probably want to do that in a way where it's it tests if it's okay first. So if you have a blueprint, it can deploy to a test sandbox environment first, make sure that everything's good, run your tests against it, and then flip that same configuration over to prod. I wasn't at Netflix at the time, but I talked to some of the Netflix friends, and they were able to extremely quickly like roll everything over because they had this ability to basically do quick deployments, quick rollbacks. They could push what they call a campaign, which is like a library update to all of the affected stuff. So their response time was just much, much faster than many organizations because of all the tooling that they'd built. This is where like blueprints come in handy, right? If you want that kind of power, but you don't want to have to teach all of your developers how to do it, you just give them a standard pattern that they can use and stamp it out and repeat.
Yeah, that's much more easier because we communicating it manually and asking them to add this kind of a hot patch to their sprint cycle and getting it fixed in 1 or 2 weeks, rather than have a blue-green kind of a deployment. Just roll out the changes at scale using the infrastructure as a code templates much more faster, and the mean time of remediation also drastically reduces, which is a good thing for the security teams out there. With that, right, Travis, I have another question, which is majorly based on what are the different tools, open source tools, or whatever the tools and processes that enterprise organizations can be using to make sure those cloud deployments are adhering to the blueprints. Sometimes, always the DevOps folks creates a blueprint, and that blueprint can be a secure blueprint, or it can be an insecure blueprint, or it can be a secure blueprint like a couple of months back. Now it is outdated. It has to be matured. So what are the processes and tools can be used to make sure the DevOps engineers only use the right hardened templates or blueprints in the cloud environments?
Yeah. So on the open source side, I really like SemGrep. I think SemGrep is, extremely versatile tool. I think people think like, oh, this is going to do like static code analysis, and it can do some of that for sure. But I think the really cool use of SemGrep is like making sure that your patterns are actually being used and followed. From Resourcely side, what we do is if you use blueprints, we track all of the infrastructure that was created from that blueprint, and that helps us do things like updates with time. Our view also is like, what do companies care about? So like, if you use the blueprint, it'll save you time for sure. But what they really care about is like, did you follow all of the best practices in the blueprint? And so if your developers can write, perfect configuration, they didn't need the blueprint, like that's actually fine. What we care about is like, did all the requirements get followed? So this is where we actually lean a lot on guardrails. Guardrails can just, check and make sure that each one of those settings is met. It can do like a block if somebody didn't follow a setting. And then the point over time with a blueprint is like, it'll just make it easy for you. So if you don't want to have to learn about all these settings, just use the blueprint, right? It's the fastest and easiest path.
Yeah. And also, right, there are also some mechanisms where you can use some kind of policy enforcement validation checks on the CI/CD level. You can use Open Policy Agent kind of a tool to make sure they are deploying the latest blueprints and not the outdated ones or the hardened ones. So those type of things as well can be used, right?
Yep. Yeah. We also do, going back to campaigns, like one of the uses for campaigns that customers are really excited about is getting people to like update module versions or update provider versions. In too many companies, like those things just sit there, right? You have like 10 new versions of the module that people haven't updated to yet. Because it can be scary for them, right? If you update a module, it might break something. So campaigns will assist in those upgrades, and then also, via guardrails, like basically tell you, like, yeah, this is good. It's a no op. It's not going to break anything. Or like, okay, something's changing here. You should go pay like very close attention to it before you deploy it.
Yeah. And Travis, I have a common question that I normally ask to a lot of cloud security and product security practitioners out there. So the common question is, if you are trying to go ahead and build a software or an application, what is your best lifecycle toolkit? I mean, what are the different open source tools, or what are the different security guardrails or blueprints that you would be using in that lifecycle, from the developer's code to the production application that is running and the monitoring level? What's your dream toolkit?
Oh, Dream Stack. Okay, so I can control everything here.
Yeah, you can touch on everything here.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. So I would say this like goes down in the beginning to language choice. So some languages are going to be like by default safer than others. I really like Go just because it has such a featureful standard library. They've done a ton of work to make things secure by default and give you a lot of like secure functions that will handle things the right way. So I would start trying to standardize on something like Go. There's obviously like other good choices there, but Go's a good balance of like pretty easy, pretty performant, and has a lot of these like bells and whistles built into it. I would want my developers to not have to worry about how do they actually get this thing updated, right? Like when they have like a new version, give them like a really good CI/CD pipeline. Within that, like this is the kind of thing that we don't want our developers to have to invent themselves. So give them like really good CI/CD template for it. So that'll handle like all of the build, test, deploy. Obviously in that test, you'd like to have a whole bunch of the like linter functions in there. So something like semgrep or GoSec, just integrated straight into the pipeline. In terms of like the actual like cloud footprint, like blueprints, again, like this is great, right? It's like, what do we need to run? Are we running container? Are we running, in Kubernetes? Are we running virtual machines? So like give the developer just like a blueprint that sets up like whatever their preferred like target environment is. And then any kind of like monitoring that you have should obviously be baked into that deployment. So, Golden AMI, it has your monitoring, your agents, all of that covered. The blueprints include that Golden AMI. That way, when you need to do updates to it, you change the AMI one time. People already have good machinery to like go and build, test, and deploy a new version. So yeah, I think that kind of like end-to-end stack is beautiful. We had a lot of this stuff at Netflix. I think that took a long time to build. Most organizations don't have the resources to build it themselves. So I think there's a lot of value for both open source and then commercial offerings to help.
Yeah. I mean, a ton of folks used to follow the Netflix OSS blogs as well, and the Skunk Works and all that stuff. So pretty solid. And in terms of like pipeline, right? The pipeline you mentioned, like an amazing CI/CD pipeline with all the linters and amazing stuff. Can you dive deep a bit more on what's the tech stack for the pipelines that you prefer?
Yeah, so I mean, I really like the native stuff built into GitHub. So I think GitHub, especially with GitHub Actions, you can just have everything just live alongside your code. You can trigger all of the right kind of stuff. Back in the day, we used to use things like Jenkins. Jenkins was like notorious for these plugins that were like be out of date, and kind of like the WordPress problem, right? You have all these plugins. Some of them are like maybe bad, some are out of date. Obviously, Jenkins has like very permissive settings, like it needs to do its job. So you really don't want compromise there. In fact, we would often get like a red team to come in and do basically a review and see like how far they could get, and they would go straight to CI/CD just because it's kind of brittle and it has a lot of permissions. So I think today, with GitHub Actions, you can do a lot of stuff there, and you're probably already using GitHub, so you don't have to necessarily go and buy anything new.
Yep. And you mentioned blueprints can be used as well for security. Are there any good open source libraries or open source projects out there that host the blueprints out there, Travis?
The host blueprints?
That people can use.
I haven't seen too much. Like there's like module registries, but they're usually a paid feature of whatever you're using for a Terraform deployment. The blueprints themselves, like they're templates, right? They can just sit into GitHub, so you don't really need anything itself. Where the blueprints like solutions come in handy is like guiding folks about like what to fill into the templates, discovery itself, chaining multiple of those together to accomplish a use case. But I haven't seen like too much open source. Have you?
Got it. And now, if you're trying to go ahead and monitor the external threats of an organization, right, Travis, what are the most important things and most quick wins that you would prefer to do? The external assets, external threats for your organization.
I'm gonna defer to you on this. Like my background is more on the like kind of AppSec, CloudSec side. So staying up to date, obviously, with like all of the like having SBOM, like all of the software that you're actually using in your environment. What versions, things like that. That tooling is critical for sure. You want to stay on top of just known vulnerable. Like people worry about 0-day too much, in my opinion. They're probably going to get compromised by the 365-year-old vulnerability they have. So I'd say that those first. But yeah, I mean, you tell me about the threat intel and external risk. I think this is more your world.
Sure. I mean, personally, right, what would I suggest is when it comes to using, monitoring your external footprint, always start with a quick script that pulls all your domains from your DNS registry. Either you're using Route 53 or you're using Cloudflare. Just make a quick API call, list all that stuff, and then quickly identify what are the different subdomains that are out there. Just by integrating your DNS records or registries, get all the subdomains, and also check for any historical subdomains as well using some open source scanners. There are like Nmas, Amas, all these amazing scanners out there. Quick script, Python script, a wrapper gives you a lot of intel around all the subdomains. Then the next thing you care about is if you're an organization that is not cloud native organization, that what would I prefer is using an Nmap kind of an open source tool to go ahead and identify what are the different ports that belongs to this organization, identify them. What are the ASN numbers that belongs to this organization, add them. Map all those CIDRs, find all the IP addresses, IP spaces, the public ports, and then do a quick banner grab on the ports, identify the services, and map the services to the CPEs. Go ahead and find the vulnerabilities on those CPEs as CVEs, and then try to understand how many of those CVEs are doing some advanced vulnerability intelligence, how many are like active, how many are like non-active. Because the attackers, most of the time, they don't go ahead and target your organization with zero-day vulnerabilities. They normally go ahead and use an exploit, and then use that exploit to use a huge bot to scan millions of IP addresses. They will find thousands of IPs that are vulnerable, and then they go ahead and use a secondary script to send the payloads to check whether they get a 200 OK kind of a post, a shell upload kind of a success message. So my suggestion is always follow the KEV kind of a database that publishes all the latest intelligence. I mean, multiple certs that are out there in multiple nations. Follow them, get those CVs, prioritize them. On the other side, you can also go ahead and use some cool stuff if you're using cloud environment. Like we have open source Cloud Frontier, which goes ahead and pulls all the cloud resources in a given cloud environment, and then make sure if they are public or private. So you can use a combination of external attack surface management wrapper that you have built to check it with the cloud resources that you have identified, and map and tell like, okay, is this cloud resource actually public or not? I would normally not use a CSPM tool to rely on it, because a CSPM tool will amazingly tell an EC2 server with security group 0.0.0 as public facing, irrespective of that EC2 server being in a private subnet or in a private VPC or in an egress only VPC. So the CSPM only looks at the context, doesn't look at the context, only the resource configuration it looks at, and it misses out the context of it. So you need to make sure you validate it from the outside in to understand what are the actual exposed cloud resources. And once you get this information right, it's very easy. Then run any DAST kind of a solution. Either you can leverage Nmap scripts, you can use nuclear templates, you can use any kind of basic things to find those low hanging fruits. Once you run that right, you have the low hanging fruits, and 90% of the time, the attackers leverages these low hanging fruits to get into the organization. So get those things sorted out, and you can always, I mean, that's one side of the external threat intelligence. There is brand intelligence as well. There is vendor intelligence as well. As you have mentioned, using SBOMs, how many of those third-party libraries are being uh, tampered right now by the attackers to do some supply chain attacks, kind of things. Again, that's a complex thing. So these are, I mean, at least you can get 70% of the coverage very quickly, and make sure you can avoid a lot of breaches, because 85% of the time the breaches are because of some asset that is internet facing is used as an entry point by the attackers to compromise or get into an organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are great suggestions.
Perfect. So I mean, it was really nice talking to you, Travis, and thank you so much for joining us today, and looking forward for a great of amazing things in the future as well. If you have any quick closing notes or comments, yeah, Travis, this is the time.
No, it was a fun discussion. Some of the, like, I'm passionate about blueprints. I think you are too. We do, quick plug for our stuff. We do have a self-serve, free Resourcely version that you can come in, just sign in with some existing credentials you have, and you'll get an environment with some blueprints out of the box. So anybody that's interested in trying that can come check it out today. And then campaigns as the remediation thing I talked about. We're going to be launching that this month too. So if anybody's interested in those things, please reach out. But otherwise, I really appreciate you setting this up, and thank you for the time.
Perfect. And I've been using Resourcely as well for my blueprint sort of things. It's very intuitive, easy to get on. Once your GitHub connection is done and connect cloud environments, you can keep pushing out secure stuff. So amazing. And it makes the security engineer's life very, very easy if it is configured in the right way at the first place.
Yep. Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Have a great rest of your week.